The second book of Moses, called Exodus, chapter number 20, is where we're going to return to this morning. Exodus chapter 20, if you're using one of the Pew Bibles, it's on page 50. I thoroughly enjoyed our time last week and our discussion. I gave me a lot to think on and everything this week, and so, but I really enjoyed that time together. I thought it was really good. So, Exodus chapter 20, I'm just going to read the first 3 verses that say, "And God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me." So here's my plan, if you will, for today. Hopefully for today, let's put it that way. My goal will be that we'll at least cover some of the first commandment, but that'll come toward the end. For the majority of it, I'm just going to answer some of the questions that we came up with last week and a few more that spawned as I thought them out. So, will we get to the first commandment? Maybe. Maybe not. It all depends on how far we go and maybe any other questions that you think of and throw at me as we go along. So, today we'll pretty much just be answering questions concerning the 10 commandments. And the first one to answer is the weight of the commandments. The weight of the commandments. So, this is one that we came up with last week. So, I told you last week that I would think on a bit more this week and get some clarification on it. That way I didn't want to speak where maybe I wasn't fully confident and everything like that. So the first thing, the weight of the commandments, we understand the 10 commandments carry weight or gravity as a result of what? Being from God. Because they are a representation, a reflection of His holiness, they then carry weight. But do they carry the same weight? Is taking the name of the Lord in vain equal to coveting? Is committing adultery equal to bearing false witness? And so on and so forth. We might compare them back and forth. And the short answer to do they carry the same weight is no, but also yes. No, but also yes. So I'll start with yes, and then we'll go to no. So the affirmative is yes. All the commandments carry the same weight, and maybe the word to phrase that would be condemnation. So they all carry the same weight in regard to condemnation. James 2:10 and 11 say this, "For whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point, he is guilty of all. For he who said, 'Do not commit adultery,' also said, 'Do not murder.' Now, if you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law." In other words, based on what James says here, the commandments all carry the same weight in regard to their condemnation. They all, any violation of any one commandment makes you a sinner. You are guilty of having broken the law, violating God's standard of holiness. And what you receive as a result of choosing to violate God's standard of holiness is what? Death. Death. Condemnation. Yep. And that condemnation is considered death. Just as Adam received death, we receive death. Adam's death was not an immediate death, but it would result in a physical death in the future. Maybe more apparently, we could state that death as separation from God. You remember the chasm that I mentioned last week, that violating God's holy law means God remains holy, but man is unholy. So there's a chasm, there's a gap between us and God. To break one of the commandments means you die, or you are destined to die physically, spiritually, and eternally. And so, with this gap, we need what? We need someone to pay for our sins so that the gap can be bridged so that unholy man can get back to holy God, thus solving the death and separation problem. Now, of course, we understand that's where Jesus comes in. That's what we talked about a little bit last week, is that Jesus was the illustrator, the mediator, the one that showed us how to live the law perfectly, as well as died and paid for our sins so that unholy man could get to God. So the long and short of it would be this: all the commandments carry the same weight in that all of them have the same verdict. You are going to die. You are under condemnation. You are guilty of breaking God's law. Now, the negative side of it is this: no, all the commandments do not carry the same weight, and maybe the heading to cover that would be consequence. Consequence. If you recall back to our study of Luke, in Luke chapter 11, we encountered this verse. But woe to you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and all manner of herbs, and pass by justice and the love of God. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Matthew 23 explains it this way: woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. So when we examine that, we clearly understand that Jesus prescribed varying weights to the law in general, various aspects of the law. In this case, the Pharisees were very concerned about, if I have a plant of mint that produces 10 leaves, I have to take one of those leaves and I have to tithe it. And they were also concerned with making sure everybody else did that on everything that they gained, that everybody was tithing on whatever increase they brought in. Now, at the same time, the Pharisees did what? They ignored justice, they ignored mercy, they ignored faith, they ignored love, moral laws. In other words, what the Pharisees did is they elevated things that don't matter in the grand scheme of things to a degree, and they took the things that really do matter that they should have been focused on, and they just kind of, set them aside. Who cares about those things? Did you tithe 10% of your mint plants? Or your cumin or your anise today? Jesus indicates by what he said, some things are more important than other things. Whether you tithe exactly 10% of your mint is totally inconsequential to whether or not you have loved your neighbor or whether you've shown mercy to someone in need of mercy. Someone that offends you even. So let's bring that back to the 10 Commandments. Placing and worshiping someone or something other than God, putting something before God, is obviously and clearly more severe than stealing a candy bar. Yes? I think you would agree with that putting something before God is worse than stealing a candy bar. Okay? But the consequences of doing each thing, while the condemnation may be the same, they make you a sinner, you violated God's holy law, the actual consequence of the thing is different. We would put a greater emphasis on assuring that your worship to God is right than telling you to stop stealing a candy bar. Stealing a candy bar is important. It's something that we need to deal with, yes. Just like tithing 10% of your increase. According to that law, we can get into the giving in the New Testament. That's another discussion. But tithing is important. But what's more important? What should primarily be focused? Mercy, justice, love, faith, etc. So, at the same time, consider this. When the laws are laid out later on, and the civil laws are given to Israelites, 3 of the laws carried the death penalty. 3 of the 10 Commandments carried the death penalty. Idolatry, I guess multiple of the 10 Commandments technically. Idolatry, murder, and adultery all received the death penalty. Bearing false witness against your neighbor did not carry the death penalty. So the consequence, though they all equally make you a sinner, the consequences are different things. Coveting is equally sinful. but to a different degree of consequence. Now, like I said, that brings up a couple other questions. And the next one would be the relationship to salvation, the relationship of the Ten Commandments to salvation. If violating any one command makes us equally sinners, and we receive equal condemnation, but potentially differing consequences, then what does that mean about salvation? Does that mean, could it mean, that God's mercy might run out because some people need more mercy as a result of the greater sins that they have done than others that have maybe sinned just by stealing a candy bar? Does it mean that only certain people can be saved? Is murder or idolatry or committing adultery, are those sins that would preempt you and exclude you from salvation? Does this potentially even mean that maybe some people, because they've sinned greater than other people, does this mean that they're more saved than someone else? Billy Graham famously said it this way: the ground is level, or it's attributed to Billy Graham, I should say. The ground is level at the foot of the cross. In other words, you are no more saved than I am. No matter which of the various Ten Commandments, we could argue that I have kept some of these, you've broken some of them that I have kept, and everything like that. Now granted, if we all want to admit it, we've probably all broken every single one of these in some way, shape, or form. And of course, we'll get into that as we work along and understand what Jesus says in the New Testament regarding these things. I have not received a greater or more effective salvation than you have received. In other words, the best of people and the worst of people all must come and kneel before the King and trust in his blood as the substitution for their sins. Whether you've killed 1,400 people or you've never killed anyone, or you've only killed them in your heart. There's no shortcut, no backdoor entry. Everybody comes to the cross, everybody comes to Jesus equally a sinner, and everyone can walk away equally saved. Doesn't matter whether you've broken one command or all the commands. God is, you hear it said, this business is an equal opportunity employer. Equal opportunities for everyone to be employed at this business. Well, let's say it this way. God is in the business of equal opportunity salvation. Everyone, no matter where they stand, is able to be saved no matter what, because why? Ground's level at the foot of the cross. Everybody's on the same plane when they come to Jesus. And furthermore, we're told what? Lamentations 3. Through the Lord's mercies we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. In other words, we might say it this way. It is simply impossible to exhaust God's mercy, as God's mercy is forever endless. I know those are words that I asked ChatGPT to examine maybe some of the misspellings that I have in my sermon and whatnot. And it said regarding this sentence, it said, you might consider rewording this because you're saying the same thing multiple times. It's forever endless. Yeah, exactly. It's emphasizing yes, it's endless. Yes, it's forever. It's forever endless. I know I'm contradicting. It's like it doesn't work together properly in English, but that's what it is. Forever endless. It's explaining it as much as I can. In other words, there's more than enough mercy of God to cover everybody's sins, past, present, and future. And I am confident that there's more than enough mercy to cover sins, past, present, and future, and then some, if somehow there were to be more. Also, you do not need to worry that somehow or in some way the murderer down the street may have somehow taken some of God's mercy that was available for you. That's not a thing. God's mercy is a lot like the story in the Old Testament. It's a lot like a little cruse of oil. That if you take that cruse of oil and you pour it into a barrel, the oil in the little cruse never runs out and it fills up the barrel, and the little cruse is still full. And then what did the woman do? She went to the next barrel and poured from the little cruse of oil, and it filled up all the way. And she went around, and I don't remember how many it was. Was it like 25 buckets or something like that she filled up from this little tiny cruse of oil? And what happened at the end? It was all full, and she still had the cruse of oil. And we're told that the little cruse of oil never ran out. That's kind of a good example for what God's mercy is like. There's more than enough. Though you exhaust the bucket, there's more than enough to fill it back up in this little cruse of oil. Now, the next question that came to my mind as I considered this, that I thought would be helpful for us to understand regarding the Ten Commandments, is in reference to a singular or trichotomous, a three-part law. So, I said it at the beginning of last week's message. The astute observer will notice there are more than just 10 commandments in the Bible. There's hundreds of laws. Now, it's all with a heading banner of God's law, but within God's law, I believe there are three separate distinctions. Now, not everybody believes that. There are some that believe that God's law is singular, one part. There is no delineation between the three. They are all equally bearing the same weight. They would hold that when Jesus came and fulfilled the law, he did away with all the Old Testament laws, the 10 commandments included. Jesus did away with all of them when he fulfilled them. And what Jesus then did is he established a new law in which he incorporated some aspects of the old Mosaic law into his new law. So they would say, we don't obey the 10 commandments because they transcend all of time. They would say we obey the 10 commandments because Jesus reestablished them after doing away with them. So they would say it's not really the 10 commandments, it's Jesus's commandments that we obey. I understand their viewpoint, but it does bring up some pitfalls that complicate it. The worst of those pitfalls would be that it makes it sound like God's moral law, the reflection of who he is within the 10 commandments, was capable of changing. In other words, if Jesus came and did away with all of the Mosaic law, the 10 commandments included, and then reestablished some of the 10 commandments or all of the 10 commandments, Jesus technically could have done away with the command about murder being wrong. That's a potential pitfall of that view is, what if Jesus had never said it was wrong to kill? Well, then we could just go around killing people and it wouldn't be a sin anymore. And of course, I believe most all of us look at that and say, no, that's not how that works. But that's correct. And there's other theological systems that when we're looking at a view, in order to properly vet that view, we need to take it to its furthest extremes of what it could mean to help determine its viability. There are other theological systems which, when we take them to their proper and logical ends, they twist and distort the attributes of God. And we would say that's wrong, but in reality, the people that hold it may not fully hold to the depth of that position. They may be ignorant of it. They may not realize it, but it's possible. So I'm not saying that everybody that holds to a singular law that Jesus did away with everything and reestablished, I'm not saying that they were necessarily saying that, but it is a hypothetical possibility that could cause problems within their viewpoint. Now, that's a minor view. The great majority of the church believes the second view, which is the Mosaic law has multiple distinctions. It is trichotomous. There are three parts of the Mosaic law. There is the moral law, there is the ceremonial law, and there is the civil law. And when Jesus came and fulfilled the law, he did so not by eliminating the whole thing and starting anew, but rather he fulfilled each aspect of the law as it needed to be fulfilled. He fulfilled the moral law, the 10 Commandments, by complete and perfect obedience without sin. He fulfilled the ceremonial law by becoming the spotless lamb without blemish, thus rendering clean those things that previously caused uncleanness. He fulfilled the civil law by displaying perfect justice in every single judgment that was brought to him to make, and ultimately he will fulfill the civil law that Israel had when he establishes and inaugurates a new kingdom, not bound to one nation alone, but one that has no border. Now, what evidence do I have, scripturally speaking, that the law, the Mosaic law, has 3 parts? Well, Moses seemed to think so, and he gives at least a twofold distinction in Deuteronomy 4. We read this last week. So he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, the 10 Commandments, and he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone. And the Lord commanded me at that time to teach you statutes and judgments. In other words, Moses makes 2 distinctions here. There is the 10 Commandments, God's covenant, and then there are the statutes and judgments that come forth from, we might say it this way, the application to our lives as a result of the 10 Commandments. This even helps us understand, I believe, why Jesus gives a greater weight to certain aspects, like justice, mercy, love, faith, and other things, over certain other aspects of the law that are lesser than. We might say it this way. And I got a long comment here that's on a couple slides. While the moral, ceremonial, and civil laws are all occasionally referred to under the banner of the law, Scripture, Moses, Jesus, and many of the early church fathers indicate that not all the law bears the same outworking among the Israelite people. Some aspects, i.e. the moral law, the 10 Commandments, are eternal and unchanging, thus they transcend humanity from start to finish. Some aspects, however, of the ceremonial law, which was dealing with like the sacrifices and the offerings and the festivals that they were to keep, are how God dealt with sin in anticipation of Jesus, as well as pointing to the coming Messiah. Some aspects, the civil law, which taught them, how do we treat each other? How do we deal with people that have slaves? How do we deal with people that have servants? How do we deal with paying someone who has damaged our property or accidentally killed our ox or somebody that's fallen down our well? How do we deal with these things? The laws of the nation. Some of that ceased to exist when the nation of Israel ceased to exist. However, just because it ceased to exist doesn't mean there's not application available from those things, and maybe are laws that would be helpful to be established in our own land, as some have done. So, the weight of the commandments, the relationship to salvation, the differentiation within the law, led me to consider this that hopefully will help maybe clear up some questions that might arise from that is, sin versus uncleanness. Sin versus uncleanness. Does breaking the moral law, does breaking the 10 Commandments, does that make you a sinner? Yes. Does breaking the ceremonial law, as in becoming unclean, does that make you a sinner? The answer to that is not necessarily. It could, where they overlapped, but rather it simply made you ritually unclean. Now, maybe you've made this distinction before, and you've understood it. And I think I knew it subconsciously. But over the past couple weeks, as I've been studying for the Ten Commandments, and I've been reading a lot about the atonement and various aspects of it, this week it's like the light bulb suddenly turned on in my brain, and I realized, wait a second, sin is not uncleanness. And uncleanness is not sin. Don't get me wrong. They are related, to be sure, but they are separate things. Nowhere does the Bible tell us that sin is uncleanness and uncleanness is sin. That I could find anyway. So, that begs us to ask the question, what is sin and what is uncleanness? What is sin? Well, 1 John 3:4 tells us, sin is the transgression, the violation of the law. Okay? Right there, he says, the law. Does that mean all the law? Moral, ceremonial, and civil law? At first glance, it might seem like that, but logically, that doesn't make sense. Here's why it doesn't make sense. In the Bible, to give birth to a child made you ceremonially unclean. Burying your father, coming in contact with a corpse, would make you ceremonially unclean. Eating dinner without washing your hands made you ceremonially, there you go, that's the right word. I said it wrong the last couple times. Eating dinner without washing your hands made you ceremonially unclean. So, does giving birth make you a sinner? Does eating without washing your hands make you a sinner? Does burying your father make you a sinner? Obviously not. Those are obviously not sins, violations of God's moral code. I guess burying your father could be if you first killed him and then buried him. That would make you a sinner, but I guess that's a discussion for another day. So, obviously, it doesn't make sense that violating every ceremonial law made you a sinner, because it would be impossible. You wouldn't be able to do anything living life to make you, it would all make you unclean. It would all make you a sinner. Now, certain aspects of the ceremonial law would make you a sinner because they were also transgressions of God's moral law. So, committing adultery would make you unclean, but it also made you a sinner because it was a violation of God's moral law and the ceremonial law. So some of them are 2 for 1, some of them are not. Let's put it that way. Eating pork simply made you unclean, whereas idolatry would make you both a sinner and unclean. Having a skin disease like leprosy, that wasn't a sin. Remember what they asked, what the disciples asked. They said, who sinned, this man or his father or his parents, that made him a leper? And Jesus said, no, you got it all wrong. The fact that he's a leper doesn't make him sinful. He's a sinner because he broke God's moral law, yes. But leprosy just simply was a disease. It made them unclean, but it did not make them a sinner. So, what's uncleanness? Uncleanness in the Bible is a ritual category or position that depicted impurity or filthiness. In other words, it describes the state of a person who could not enter into the tabernacle or the temple and worship God without first having cleansed themselves outwardly. This is why the woman with the issue of blood in the New Testament was in such a dire position, because she'd been menstruating for 12 years and without stopping, so she could not, at any point in time, enter the temple to give sacrifices, to worship, to visit with family and friends. She could not do that. Yes, she lost everything. She lost her family. She lost her money. She lost everything. She was probably homeless and poor and everything else you can think of. But on top of all that, she couldn't even go to the place where they would offer sacrifices to be clean because she was perpetually unclean. So, if sin is the transgression of the law, the moral law, the Ten Commandments, if you will, and uncleanness is the violation of the ceremonial law that God gives, the obvious next question, I believe, is this. What is the point of the ceremonial law then? Right? I mean, we can understand that the moral law, the Ten Commandments, show us that we are unholy and God is holy. But why did God proceed to have Moses give the people in Exodus, Leviticus, all these ceremonial laws that they had to follow, else they'd be unclean? Hebrews 9 clarifies that all the ritual cleanliness in the entering the tabernacle, the holy place, the sprinkling of the blood, all that goes into that, all of it was simply symbology. It was all a picture that pointed to the moral law in that they were sinners, and it pointed forward to the coming Messiah that would save them not simply by ritually making them clean, but by spiritually cleansing them from the violations they had made of the moral law. Let's walk through Hebrews 9 for a few minutes. Hebrews 9, verse 9 says, it was symbolic, speaking of the law, it was symbolic for the present time in which both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to the conscience. Instead, it was concerned only with foods and drinks, various washings, and fleshly ordinances imposed until the time of Reformation. In other words, all the stuff that the priests did in the temple and the tabernacle, all that did was to cleanse the people and themselves outwardly. Did nothing for the heart. Didn't cleanse the real problem. Therein we understand this, that the ceremonial laws were only symbols for Israel to see visually, to grasp physically, in that they were doing it with their hands, and to understand mentally that it showed them how bad things were between them and the holy God whose moral law they had broken spiritually. That is, until the time of Reformation. What is the time of Reformation? Verse 11 continues and says, it tells us what the time of Reformation is. That Christ came as high priest of the good things to come, with the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is not of this creation. He's speaking of, I've said it before, about how there's the Ark of the Covenant, that is only a picture and symbol of the actual real thing in heaven. That's what it's kind of talking about here. And then he goes on in verse 12 and says, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood he entered the most holy place, once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling the unclean, sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. See, the ceremonial law only existed to point to the moral law and the necessity and need for someone to bridge the gap of Israel and mankind's violation of God's holy moral law. And of course, that one is Jesus Christ. And he didn't go into the most holy place in the temple to just cleanse outwardly according to the ceremonial law. Rather, he desired to cleanse our guilty conscience that we get because we violate God's moral law, the Ten Commandments. In other words, Jesus Christ is the mediator, the bridge between God and man. That way, man could become holy enough to enjoy the benefits of a right relationship with God for all eternity, which is exactly what verse 15 says. Cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God, and for this reason, he, speaking of Jesus Christ again, is the mediator of the new covenant by means of death, for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. Notice the phraseology that he uses there. It's not simply past tense. In other words, those that are born after Jesus aren't born only into the new covenant. They are still born under the law. In other words, we might say it this way. You cannot enter the new covenant that Jesus gave his blood for until you violate the old covenant, the first covenant. And thus we have to understand from this that something within the first covenant transcends all of time. Jesus didn't come and just do away with all of it and reestablish something new. It wasn't just for Israel back then, but it's something that governed before Israel, governs even now. And I believe what Scripture shows us, that what has been transgressed under the first covenant is the Ten Commandments, God's moral law, what Moses calls God's covenant with you. That first command, and the primary of all those commandments would be what? The first one. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. One rule that rules them all. Now, I got a lot more that we could go into about commandment number 1, but we're already 5 minutes over time technically, so we're not getting to commandment number 1 today. Let me suffice it to say this. Obedience to the ceremonial law that Israel had in giving all these offerings and going to all these festivals and sacrificing all these animals, that was not the solution. That was never meant to be the solution to breaking God's moral law, the Ten Commandments. It was just a picture to show the people how bad things actually were and to point them to the coming Messiah and their belief in there will be a Messiah that will come that will bridge the gap between us and God. So I'll leave it there for now. Let's pray real quick and then we can consider some thoughts.